In this episode, we're going to move on to what's probably the most important page of our application, and that's the Paparazzi page. Because we're going to have to display a lot of information in this page, we are going to separate it into multiple subpages. And what I mean by that is each Paparazzi page will have a menu on the left, which will be responsible for what is being displayed on the right. And when it comes to mobile phone or small screens in general, we'll try and put that menu on top of the nested page. Okay, so first thing first, we're going to have to register a new route for that Paparazzi page. And because we're going to have multiple nested pages, we also need to register them. Fortunately, vue-router makes that very easy for us, so let's try and set this up. We will create a new route, and its path will be /paparazzi/id, where id is the ID of the paparazzi we're trying to display. Next, we're going to call that component paparazzi show. And we don't need to define a name for that route because the name will be taken directly from the nested routes. So let's remove that and start defining those nested routes. So we do that by defining the children property, which defines an array of nested routes. So for the first nested route, we'll make its path equals to an empty string. And that means that this is going to be the default nested routes for our Paparazzi page. And because these nested routes will display an overview of the paparazzi, we will call its component paparazzi show overview. And let's give this nested route a name that matches its component. Next, our second nested route will be displaying all of the screenshots that have been taken within that paparazzi. So we will create a new nested route and call it paparazzi show shots. And we'll make its path equals to shots. That means if a user wants to access that nested page directly, they'll have to enter /paparazzi/id/shots. Finally, we will use our last nested route to allow the user to update the settings of a paparazzi. So we'll create a new route with a path equals to settings and a component called paparazzi show settings. Okay, so now if I save this, it's not going to work because we have to create those 4 components. So let's do that. We will go to our components directory and create paparazzi show.vue, but also paparazzi show overview.vue, paparazzi show shots.vue, and finally paparazzi show settings.vue. Okay, and it's still not working, so why is that? Oh yeah, sorry, that should be a comma. Okay, so now our build is successful again. Okay, so now let's visit one of our paparazzi page by simulating an ID of 1, so /paparazzi/1. And let's go to our paparazzi show component. Okay, so let's scaffold something and see how we can access that paparazzi of ID 1 inside that component. We'll start by creating a new data attribute called paparazzi. Next, we will fetch the content of that attribute using the before-route-enter hook provided by vue-router. And that method accepts 3 arguments, which are to, from, and next. To is the route that we're now reaching, from is the route that we were before, and next is a callback that we should call whenever we are ready to move from the previous route to the new route. Okay, now in order to find that paparazzi of ID 1, we need to have access to that paparazzi stubs that we had before. So we'll import paparazzis from stubs, and we'll use that in our before route enter method. So we'll say constant paparazzi equals paparazzis.find, and now we need to find a paparazzi that has the same ID as the one that was provided in the URL. So we need to find a paparazzi p such that its ID is equals to the parameter of the URL. And we can access that parameter through the to variables. So that's to.params.id. And that ID matches what we had defined before in our routes file. So if I go back to our routes.js file, you can see that this is where we define the ID parameter. Okay, so now this should be enough for us to find our paparazzi. So now all we need to do is call the next callback and say move on to the next middleware. But whenever our component is ready, make sure that we assign its paparazzi data attribute to paparazzi. Okay, so let's go back to our template and display in a div our paparazzi name to see what's happening. Okay, so now if I save this and refresh that page, it's not working. Let's see why. So we're trying to find a paparazzi such that its ID matches. Oh yeah, okay. I see what's going on. So the ID provided by the stubs object is a number, whereas the parameter is actually a string. So instead of doing a strict comparison, we need to just write two equal signs. Okay, so now if I save this and refresh the page, we can see our paparazzi name, which matches the paparazzi of ID 1. Okay, next we need to define another vue-router hook, which is called before-route-update. And that method accepts the same arguments as the before-route-enter method. So contrary to the before-route-enter, the before-route-update method will be called whenever we update the route, but the components stay the same. So that means if we update 1 by 2 on our paparazzi URL, then we want to keep the same component, but we want to make sure we update the paparazzi variable. So basically, we can almost copy-paste what we had in before-route-enter, except that this time the component is already mounted, so we don't need to use that function. We can simply use this.paparazzi equals paparazzi, and we don't need a constant for this. So now if I save this and refresh that page, we can see it's still working, but now let's see what happens if I update the routes within the console. And we have an error here. Okay, cannot read property name of null. That's because there is a millisecond where paparazzi is equal to null when the object hasn't been loaded yet. So to go around this, I'm simply going to do vif paparazzi to make sure that this section only displays when we load the paparazzi. So now let's refresh this. Okay, that's a bit cleaner. Okay, so if I go in the View tab and I click, let's say, on the app component, you can see that I've got a $VM0, which is now available in the console. So I can go to the console and say $VM0.router.push, and now I can push a page which will simulate a router update. So in our case, let's go to paparazzi/2, so /paparazzi/2. And as you can see, the update was instant, and that's because we didn't have to reload the component or anything. All we did was update the paparazzi variable within that component. And that was the whole purpose behind before-route-update. One last thing that I'd like to do in that before-route-update method is to make sure that we don't fetch the paparazzi again if we're going from the same ID to the same ID. So if I go from paparazzi/2 to paparazzi/2, I don't want it to fetch that paparazzi again. And that's also going to be useful when we go from, let's say, /paparazzi/2 to /paparazzi/2/settings, for example. So let's do that. We'll say if 2.params.id is the same as from.params.id, then don't fetch anything and simply go to the next middleware. So now to see that one, I'm going to add a console log that says fetching paparazzi. And now if I refresh that page and I go again and make my VM0 variable available, go back to the console, VM0.router.push, and we'll go to /paparazzi/2/settings. You can see that we've now moved to the setting page, but we haven't fetched the paparazzi because we can't see that in the console. Okay, so now we're actually ready to display those nested pages. So I'm going to remove that login, and here, instead of paparazzi name, I'm going to write router view and I'm going to give the paparazzi as a props. Next, let's go to our paparazzi show overview component, and we'll accept the paparazzi as a props. And for now, we'll simply display a panel, so base panel, and that panel will contain the name of the paparazzi, as well as the name of the nested page, in this case, overview, so that we really know which page we're displaying. So now I'm going to save this and copy it for the other nested page. So paparazzi show shots and paparazzi show settings. Okay, so now if I go back to /paparazzi/1, we can see GitHub profile overview, and if I do /shots, you can see that we are in the paparazzi show shots component. Now in this episode, we won't have time to design the content of those nested pages, but we just about have time to display the menu that's going to switch from one nested route to the other. So let's go back to our paparazzi show component and create a menu array here. Our first menu item will take us to the paparazzi show overview component, so we'll give it the same name as the route that we can call to reach that page. So paparazzi show overview. We'll display that menu item as overview, and we'll give it an icon called view visible. Now let's do the same for paparazzi show shots and paparazzi show settings. Now we will go back to our templates and add a router link for each of our menu items. So router link v4 menu item in menu, and we'll give it the name as a key. And since we don't have many attributes in the menu item objects, let's destructure this. So instead of menu item, we can write name, title, and icon. And here we can simply use name. Now it's not happy because we're not using title or icon, but we will in a minute. Next, we'll make sure that this router link goes to a route which is named name, and we'll have to specify the ID as a parameter. So params ID paparazzi.id. Now inside that router link, we can display the icon and the title of this menu item. So base icon, where the icon has been specified in the menu item, and we'll give it a fixed width of 5, a fixed height of 5, a fill current, and a margin right of 2, because right next to it we will have the title. Okay, so let's see what happens if I save this and refresh the page. So we still have to update the design of our menu, but you can see that if I click on the menu items, the nested page actually updates. Okay, so let's improve that design real quick. We'll make that div a flex container, which is vertical by default, but horizontal when we reach the medium breakpoint. Next, we will wrap our router links in a div and make it a full width by default, and a width of, let's say, 40 when we are reaching the medium breakpoint. And no matter what happens, let's give it a margin bottom of 4 and a lighter color, so gray 600. Next, we also need to wrap our router view in a div, and that div will need to be a flex 1 to take all of the space available. And when the menu is on the left, we will give it a left padding of 8. Okay, so now if I save this and refresh the page, you can see that our menu is on top when the screen is small, but when it's big enough, it will sit on the left side of the page. Okay, next I'd like the menu item to look differently if it's active, which means that we are displaying the nested page that it links to. So to do that, we'll create a new method called isActive. And all that method does is it takes the name of a route and returns true if that route is the active route. And we can figure this out using the this.name $route variable. And this is a variable provided by vue-router that always returns the current route. So if we want the name of the current route, all we have to do is .name. So to complete this method, all we have to do is check that the name is equal to that. Okay, so now we can go back to our router links and say class. If that router link is active, then display some classes, or otherwise display some others. In our case, if it's active, we'll want to make the text blue. And if it's not active, we want the text to be black when we hover on top of it. So hover text gray 900. And now you can see that with the isActive method, we have actually more control over what we display. Alternatively, I could have defined the active class attributes as text blue 600, and that would have worked, but I would have had no way to define some classes that are used only when the link is inactive. Okay, so now let's define some normal classes. We need to make the router link a centered flex container so that the icon and the title are aligned together. So flex items center. But because we want these menu items to be next to each other on mobile, we will make it an inline flex by default and make it a flex only when we reach the medium breakpoint. Okay, finally, let's give it a horizontal padding of 4 and a vertical padding of 2, and let's make it a little bit bolder. So now if I save this and refresh that page, yeah, that is much better, and if I increase the size of the screen, they are displayed on top of one another. Okay, so before we wrap up, we'll just make sure that our icon uses 2 different colors for their primary and secondary parts. So let's go back to our components and define primary and secondary. Now the colors will depend on whether the link is active or not. So we will use isActive here and here, and define some classes if it is active and some others if it's not. If it is active, we'll make them blue 300 and 500. And if they are not active, we'll make them gray 400 and 500. And we'll also make sure to update the colors of the icon when we hover on top of the link. So we'll use group hover like we did in our base components before. So first we need to make this our group. And then we can say group hover text gray 600 and 700. Okay, so let's see what we've got. Okay, so it almost works, except that the icon stays active for the original link and doesn't update when we click on another link. And this is because our isActive method is not a computed property or a data property, so it's not reactive. So when the isActive method returns something else, there is no way for the base icon component to know to update itself. So one way to do it is to force the base icon component to re-render itself by defining the key attributes. So if we go back to our base icon here, we can say key equals isActive name. So now if I save this and refresh our page, you can see that our active state follows wherever we click. And the same goes for big screens. Okay, so let's call it a day for this episode. We've managed to prepare the base of our Paparazzi page with a Paparazzi shot component that handle the fetching of the Paparazzi object, as well as the sub-page navigation. On the next 3 episodes, we will design the content of those 3 sub-pages, starting with the overview sub-page.